This with the air of adding, "Convey me to the stake if you will, but while I live I will be candid." "And now what apartments, ma'am?" asked Mr. Grewgious cosily, to tame a certain severity apparent on the part of Mrs. Billickin. "There is this sitting-room, which, call it what you will, it is the front parlour, miss," said Mrs. Billickin, impressing Rosa into the conversation. "The back parlour being what I cling to, and never part with. And there is 2 bedrooms at the top of the house, with gas laid on. I do not tell you that your bedroom floors is firm, for firm they are not. The gas-fitter himself allowed that to make a firm job, he must go right under your jists, and it were not worth the outlay as a yearly tenant so to do. The piping is carried above your jists, and it is best that it should be made known to you." Mr. Grewgious and Rosa exchanged looks of some dismay, though they had not the least idea what latent horrors this carriage of the piping might involve. Mrs. Billickin put her hand to her heart, as having eased it of a load. "Well, the roof is all right, no doubt," said Mr. Grewgious, plucking up a little. "Mr. Grewgious," returned Mrs. Billickin, "if I was to tell you, sir, that to have nothink above you is to have a floor above you, I should put a deception upon you which I will not do. No, sir, your slates will rattle loose at that elevation in windy weather. Do your utmost, best or worst. I defy you, sir, be you what you may, to keep your slates tight. Try how you can." Here Mrs. Billickin, having been warm with Mr. Grewgious, cooled a little, not to abuse the moral power she held over him. "Consequent," proceeded Mrs. Billickin more mildly, but still firmly in her incorruptible candour, "consequent, it would be worse than of no use to me to traipse and travel up to the top of the house with you, and for you to say, 'Mrs. Billickin, what stain do I notice in the ceiling? For a stain I do consider it,' and for me to answer, 'I do not understand you, sir.' No, sir, I will not be so underhand. I do understand you before you pint it out. It is the wet, sir. It do come in, and it do not come in. You may lay dry there half your lifetime, but the time will come, and it is best that you should know it, when a dripping sop would be no name for you." Mr. Grewgious looked much disgraced by being prefigured in this pickle. "Have you any other apartments, ma'am?" he asked. "Mr. Grewgious," returned Mrs. Billickin with much solemnity, "I have. You ask me, have I? And my open and honest answer air, I have. The first and second floors is vacant, and sweet rooms." "Come, come, there's nothing against them," said Mr. Grewgious, comforting himself. "Mr. Grewgious," replied Mrs. Billickin, "pardon me, there is the stairs. Unless your mind is prepared for the stairs, it will lead to inevitable disappointment." "You cannot, miss," said Mrs. Billickin, addressing Rosa reproachfully, "place a first floor, and far less a second, on the level footing of a parlour. No, you cannot do it, miss. It is beyond your power, and wherefore try?" Mrs. Billickin put it very feelingly, as if Rosa had shown a headstrong determination to hold the untenable position. "Can we see these rooms, ma'am?" inquired her guardian. "Mr. Grewgious," returned Mrs. Billickin, "you can. I will not disguise it from you, sir. You can. Mrs. Billickin then sent into her back parlour for her shawl, it being a state fiction dating from immemorial antiquity that she could never go anywhere without being wrapped up, and having been enrolled by her attendant, led the way. She made various genteel pauses on the stairs for breath, and clutched at her heart in the drawing-room, as if it had very nearly got loose, and she had caught it in the act of taking wing. "And the second floor?" said Mr. Grewgious, on finding the first satisfactory. "Mr. Grewgious," replied Mrs. Billickin, turning upon him with ceremony, as if the time had now come when a distinct understanding on a difficult point must be arrived at, and a solemn confidence established. "The second floor is over this." "Can we see that too, madam?" "Yes, sir," returned Mrs. Billickin. "It is open as the day." That also proving satisfactory, Mr. Grewgious retired into a window with Rosa for a few words of consultation, and then, asking for pen and ink, sketched out a line or two of agreement. In the meantime, Mrs. Billickin took a seat, and delivered a kind of index to, or abstract of, the general question. 45 per week by the month, certain at the time of year," said Mrs. Billickin, "is only reasonable to both parties. It is not Bond Street, nor yet St. James's Palace, but it is not pretended that it is. Neither is it attempted to be denied, for why should it? That the arching leads to a mews. Muses must exist. Respecting attendance, 2 is kept at liberal wages. Words has arisen as to tradesmen, but dirty shoes on fresh hearthstoning was attributable, and no wish for a commission on your orders. Coals is either by the fire or per the scuttle." She emphasized the prepositions as marking a subtle but immense difference. "Dogs is not viewed with favour. Besides litter, they get stole, and sharing suspicions is apt to creep in, and unpleasantness takes place." By this time Mr. Grewgious had his agreement lines and his earnest money ready. "I have signed it for the ladies, ma'am," he said, "and you'll have the goodness to sign it for yourself. Christian and surname there, if you please." "Mr. Grewgious," said Mrs. Billickin, in a new burst of candour, "no, sir. You must excuse the Christian name." Mr. Grewgious stared at her. "The door plate is used as a protection," said Mrs. Billickin, "and acts as such, and go from it I will not." Mr. Grewgious stared at Rosa. "No, Mr. Grewgious, you must excuse me. So long as this house is known indefinite as Billickin's, and so long as it is a doubt with the riff-raff where Billickin may be hidden, near the street door or down the airy, and what his weight and size, so long I feel safe. But commit myself to a solitary female statement, no, miss, nor would you for a moment wish," said Mrs. Billickin, with a strong sense of injury, "to take that advantage of your sex, if you were not brought to it by inconsiderate example." Rosa, reddening as if she had made some most disgraceful attempt to overreach the good lady, besought Mr. Grewgious to act content with any signature; and accordingly, in a baronial way, the sign manual Billickin got appended to the document. Details were then settled for taking possession on the next day but one, when Miss Twinkleton might be reasonably expected, and Rosa went back to Furnival's Inn on her guardian's arm. Behold Mr. Tartar walking up and down Furnival's Inn, checking himself when he saw them coming, and advancing towards them. "It occurred to me," hinted Mr. Tartar, "that we might go up the river.